Jessica Anderson will present a talk entitled The Cult of True Womanhood today. The notion that in order to be a true woman, one must believe that women are pious and submissive daughters, wives, mothers, only concerning themselves with home and family. Why did some women rebel at and some women embrace this notion? How does this belief play out across suffragettes and their detractors? Suffragettes went through campaigns designed to divide and abolish their movement. Yet there was also a growing contingent of female suffragettes that wanted to expand their mission to include the rights of people of color, men, women, and other undesirables. How did this goal conflict with the main tenets of the original suffragettes? So our speaker, Jessica Anderson, would like us to know that she was born in Tennessee, became the wife of a Yooper, a mother of 5 and grandmother of 2. She retired from the U.S. Navy after 20 years of active duty service. Said she removed temporarily to the UP in June of 2003. She realized may not be so short a move, where she has taken up a career in massage therapy. A recent graduate of Finlandia University with a minor in Finnish studies. Now she feels a need to learn Finnish as well as working on her own version of Sisu. So without further ado, we welcome Jessica Anderson.
Good morning. I hope to get through this without too much mumble mouthness, but it might be difficult because there's a lot of stuff. So I'm ready to start whenever you are, Janine. Okay, the cult of true womanhood, as Horst said, it's the idea that only true women are pious, submissive, as wives, mothers, and daughters concerned exclusively with home and family. Next. So the traditional gender roles of the 19th and 20th century. The characteristics of the feminine mind were described as tenderness and simplicity, which made home life more amiable to the man who had to deal with corrupt and complex world. Men were encouraged to trust a woman as a confidant and a friend. Women expressed disappointment if they were not able to serve their husbands as mental and physical companions. 4, if the character of women were thoroughly understood, they would be found to be too good to be hated, yet not good enough to be idolized. Women were expected to be pure, and the magazines of the day provided sufficient fear of the dangers of impurity. But only women were coached directly on remaining pure. Men were advised what to do to get back on track once they had strayed. But they were first advised about the importance of their desires and satisfaction. A man was expected to respect purity. If he made any overtures and a woman stopped him from violating her purity, he was expected to be grateful to her. He would think much more of a woman who saved him from himself than he would of a woman who allowed him to ruin her purity. A woman's wisdom in these matters of delicacy was her means of influence over the nature of man. Submissive wives received praise and were supposedly rewarded with a happy home and a faithful husband. Assertive women were bound to be punished for violating the natural order of the universe. Next. Suffragist or suffragette. Suffragette originally referred to a very specific and controversial kind of woman. The French suffix ette denotes something that is diminutive. Over the centuries, it has become a marker of things that are short or smaller than usual. For example, cigarette is a small cigar, roulette is a small wheel. In the early 1900s, when newspapermen were tasked with reporting on the militant shift in the women's movement that bubbled up in Britain circa 1906, away from polite petitions and editorials arguing for the right and towards breaking windows, this suffix was used to mock the new wave of historical agitators and cranks, as one newspaper described women. The word suffragette, however, was used to describe strictly women, and the type who were disrupting local meetings, spitting on policemen, the type who were getting arrested and going on hunger strikes in prison, and in one case, taking an axe to the famous painting of Venus admiring herself in a mirror, which happened to be hanging in London's National Gallery at the time. While the women in America continue to prefer this more serious and respected label suffragist, many high-profile British advocates, particularly those associated with the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, decided to embrace the term that had caught on quickly in the press. The WSPU named their journal The Suffragette and published this note in 1914. When a girl asked what the difference between a suffragist and a suffragette was, the answer to her question, the suffragist just wants the vote, while the suffragette means to get it by any means. Next. Women have been voting in Wyoming for 150 years. In the years during the Civil War, the Democrats and Republicans battled over expanding voting rights, particularly a fierce battle over suffrage for women and Black men emerged in Kansas, where national suffrage organizations invested a lot of time and money. The effort failed. In 1967, when the new legislature, mostly Republican, voted down women's suffrage, but supported suffrage for Black men. After the war, Democrats continued to oppose some of the most important changes the war had brought about, particularly full citizenship and voting rights for Black people, both the recently freed slaves and the Northern Blacks who had been more or less free already. In the fall of 1868, Ulysses S. Grant, a Republican, was elected president. Grant soon appointed many loyal Republicans to run the brand new Wyoming territory. Among these, as Attorney General, was Joseph M. Carey, who quickly issued an official legal opinion that no one in Wyoming could be denied the right to vote based on race. Democrats saw this opinion as a move to make sure Wyoming's Black people voted Republican. When a territory-wide election was held early in September, only Democrats were elected. The new delegates to Congress was Democrat, and all 22 members of the territorial legislature were Democrats. These legislators, all white and male, had many reasons for supporting women's suffrage when they met in 1869. Positive news stories published throughout the nation might bring more women. There were 6 adult men to every adult woman and very few children. American Indians were not counted in these numbers, but Chinese workers, most of whom had come to work on the railroad, and Black people were counted. Democrats hoped that once these women came to Wyoming, they would continue to vote for the party that had given them the vote in the first place. They hoped to push John Campbell, Democrats hoped to push John Campbell too far with a vote for women. As they passed the bill, many assumed Campbell would veto it, but the bill passed 6-2. Voters had to be a citizen or swear an oath that they were seeking citizenship, which meant that the right did not extend to Native Americans and Chinese immigrants who were excluded from citizenship at the time. In the 1870 election, Black women officially were able to vote under the law, but it's unknown if any did. At the time, there were only 3 Black women in the population of just under 800. The Laramie newspaper did note that 93 women voted in 1870, but did not mention any names other than Louisa Swan. Swan became the first woman to legally vote at the same level as a man in the United States, 50 years before the 19th Amendment gave all women the right to vote in the US. Wyoming was the first place in the world to do so. Next. Could women of color vote in the 1870 election? It appears that there would have been no legal bars to non-white women who were over 21 and US citizens voting in Wyoming after the passage of the Women's Suffrage Act of 1869. Now, whether they exercised this right during the 1870 election is under question. There were few women in the territory and even fewer women of color. Anecdotal evidence is scarce, but it does exist. Voting at the time was not done by secret ballot. The Laramie Daily Sentinel, for example, announced the day after the election that 93 women had voted in Laramie, of whom 64 had voted on the Republican ticket. There are no voter rolls at the time, so it would be very difficult to find exactly who voted in 1870 in Laramie, and of those, how many were women of color. But 6 years after that event, the Wyoming Territorial Supreme Court Justice John Kingman recalled a group of African-American women voting in the 1870 election in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He said, "I remember a case in point, which at the time caused me much uneasiness. We had at first a large proportion of Southern men and Northern Copperheads. By Copperheads, I mean men who had advocated secession and came to Wyoming to escape being drafted in the Civil War. Carriages were employed by the candidates to bring ladies to the polls. At the hotel were a number of colored girls employed as servants. After a while, a carriage drove up with 4 of these colored girls in it. They were helped out, and as they went up to the polls, the crowd quietly parted. They voted and returned to the carriage without a word said. Then I breathed freely, as I knew all was safe." In 1870, only 10 Black women over the age of 21 were enumerated in the territory, all of whom would have been eligible to vote. By 1890, that number had grown to 187 total Black women, though this most likely included a few Asian and civilized Native American women as well. Only 5 Asian women were enumerated in 1870. The 1890 census statistics did not break out gender numbers or ages for non-Black colored classifications. These few women were lumped into the colored category. Most likely, women reported as Asian would not have been eligible to vote, as nearly all were foreign-born and not naturalized citizens. With some exceptions, Native American women would not have qualified to vote until 1924, when Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act. Federal census statistics did not include numbers for Hispanic/Latino women until the 1980 census, when Hispanic became a racial classification option. Prior to 1980, the Hispanic Latino population was included in the other non-white classification. Next, founding mothers. The first campaign for women's suffrage was well underway decades before the Civil War. During the 1820s and 30s, most states had given the ability to vote to all men, all white men that is, regardless of how much money or property they had. At the same time, various reform groups were spreading across the United States: temperance leagues, religious movements, moral reform societies, anti-slavery organizations, and women played a prominent role in many of these groups. This activism by women contributed to a new way of thinking about what it meant to be both a woman and a US citizen. Women were often encouraged to wear white in suffrage parades, suggesting the purity and the high-mindedness of their goals. This choice was in keeping with the true woman being described as pure, demure, and self-sacrificing. In the US, gold was the color that represented women's suffrage movement. The use of gold goes back to 1867 when Kansas was considering the passage of the state suffrage referendum. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony adopted Kansas, the Kansas state flower, the sunflower, as the symbol of the suffrage cause. Next. So if you'll notice on this map, if you get a chance to look at it, there were many states and territories that actually allowed women to vote before 1920. Next. So the Seneca Falls Convention happened on July 19 through 20 in 1848. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thus, the Declarations of Sentiments was unveiled. It called upon women to organize and to petition for their rights. The convention passed 12 resolutions, 11 unanimously, designed to gain certain rights and privileges that women of the era were denied. The 9th resolution demanded the right to vote, and it narrowly passed with the insistence of Stanton. The text in the Declaration of Sentiments lies out 6 facts which highlight the extent of this oppression, including the lack of women's suffrage, participation and representation in the government, women's lack of property rights in marriage, inequality in divorce law, and inequality in education and employment opportunities, and insists that women be viewed as full citizens of the United States and be granted all the same rights and privileges that were granted to men. 68 women and 32 men, including Frederick Douglass, signed the Declaration of Sentiments, although many eventually withdrew their names because of the intense ridicule and criticism received after the document was made public. No Black women attended this convention, and none were invited. The original, if you look on the slide, there's a copy of the original tract that was produced for the convention, and it was produced by the North Star Printing Office, which was owned by Frederick Douglass out of Rochester, New York. Next. Frederick Douglass. His original name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, and he was one of the most eminent human rights leaders of the 19th century. In 1841, Douglass was invited to an anti-slavery convention held in Nantucket, Mass. He was asked to describe his feelings and experiences under slavery. These remarks were so eloquent that he was catapulted into a new career as an agent for the Mass Anti-Slavery Society. From that point, despite heckling and mockery, insult, and violent personal attack, Douglass never wavered in his devotion to the abolitionist cause. To avoid recapture by his former owner, whose name and location he had given in the narrative, Douglass left on a 2-year speaking tour in Great Britain and Ireland, where he helped to win many new friends for the abolition movement and to cement the bonds of humanitarian reform between the continents. He returned with enough money to purchase his freedom and also to start his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star, which he published from 1947 to 1960 in Rochester, New York. During the Civil War, Douglass became a consultant to President Lincoln, advocating that former slaves be armed for the North and that the war be made a direct confrontation against slavery. Throughout Reconstruction, he fought for full civil rights for freedmen and vigorously supported the women's rights movement. He also became the first Black citizen to hold high rank in the US government. Next. The Civil War and its effect on women's suffrage. With the Civil War, the women's rights movement lost any momentum that it had gained, as the 14th and 15th Amendment freed enslaved people, the 14th Amendment ensured that citizens with equal rights meant male, and that the 15th Amendment gave Black men the technical right to vote. This led to some suffragists refusing to support the 15th Amendment, with some allying themselves with racists to argue that white women's vote would cancel out a Black person's vote. Next. By the 1890s, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, two national groups, merged to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association. However, their approach differed. Instead of arguing that they deserved the right to vote because they were equal to men, they argued they deserved the vote because they were different from men. This led to allying themselves with temperance groups as well as white supremacy groups in order to maintain the social status quo. But not everyone was able to participate in NAWSA, although they did not exclude African American women from membership at the national level. State and local organizations could and did choose to exclude them. Conventions held in southern cities like Atlanta in 1895 and New Orleans in 1903 were segregated. NAWSA also required Black women to march separately during its 1913 parade in Washington, D.C. Even within this socially progressive movement, racism persisted. Next. Even though it's hard to fathom, there were anti-suffrage campaigns. The organizations began to emerge in the late 1890s, particularly founded and made up by women. The female leaders of the anti-suffrage campaign were generally women of wealth, privilege, social status, and even political power, who were doing comparatively quite well under the existing system, with incentives to hang onto a system that privileged them. Anti-suffrage leaders in the North were generally urban, often daughters and or wives of well-to-do men of business, banking, or politics. They were also quite likely to be involved in reform work that adhered to traditional gender norms. While Southern anti-suffrage leaders were generally planter class, and so their resistance was also tied more explicitly to worries about disruption of the racial order. Opinion polls throughout the suffrage campaign denounced the behavior of suffragists as unfeminine, violent, sexual deviance, hysteria, unnaturalness, and threat to other women. These polls continue to find that the majority of women not wanting a vote, which led to their active involvement in the anti-suffrage campaign, saying women should concentrate on womanly duties and be an example through their behavior, service, and gentle influence on men for good. Some anti-suffrage groups believe that giving women the vote would threaten the institution of family and their role. Some believe women on whole were not informed enough to vote, and to do so would weaken the entirety of the government. Just like men and women supporting votes for women, men and women also organized against suffrage. Anti-suffragists argued that most women didn't want the vote because they took care of home and children, and they said women didn't have time to vote or stay updated on politics, and that they lacked the expertise or mental capacity to offer useful opinion about political issues. Others asserted that women's votes would simply double the electorate. Voting would cost more without adding any new value. Next. And here are some of the ladies of the anti-suffrage movement, and I believe they're listed from left to right. There was Josephine Jewel Dodge. She was an American educator, an early leader of the day nursery movement, and also an anti-suffrage activist. Minnie Bronson. She was the general secretary of the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. Madeline Dahlgren was an American writer and a translator. Anne Riley Hale was an American teacher, author, and social critic. In her lifetime, she was known for her criticism of Theodore Roosevelt and her anti-suffrage and anti-vaccine activity. Ann Meyer, an American author and an anti-suffrage and a promoter of higher education for women. Alice Wadsworth. She was an anti-suffrage leader during the early 20th century. She was the daughter of John Hay, who was the 37th United States Secretary, and Clara L. Stone, who was married to Senator James Wadsworth Jr. of New York in 1902. Next. NAOWS, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. Anti-suffrage views dominated among men and women through the earliest 20th century. Suffragists had the national organization since 1869, but anti-suffragists had not found their own group until 1911. Before organizing, suffrage opponents bonded without official institution. Artists created political cartoons that mocked suffragists. Religious leaders spoke out against women's political activism from the pulpit. Articles attacked women who took part in public life. Even without coordinating institution, opposition to suffrage remained popular. In 1860s, Massachusetts was home to suffrage advocates, and it was also one of the first states with an organized anti-suffrage group. Josephine Dodge in 1911 founded the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, NAOWS. And it was the first national organization of women who challenged the fight for women's suffrage. The association gained a significant momentum between 1912 and 1916 and was operational in 25 states. It was said that this organization at one point had as many as 350,000 members. At the start, it was run by Josephine Dodge and Minnie Bronson. Alice Wadsworth assumed leadership when the association moved from New York to Washington. In 1917, the anti-suffrage movement began to expand their scope to include anti-radical rhetoric. The anti-suffrage movement focused less on issues of suffrage and began to spread the fear of radical ideas and to use conspiracy paranoia. Suffragists were accused of subversion of the government and treason, of being socialists, Bolsheviks, and unpatriotic German sympathizers. Accusations of being associated with these unpopular radical movements was named after the NAOWS president, Alice Wadsworth, as Wadsworthy attacks. Anti-suffrage movements in the American South included an appeal to conservatism and white supremacy. In Virginia, this chapter linked race riots to women's suffrage. But once the 19th Amendment was passed, some women who opposed the suffrage exercised the right that was won. They took the energy they were investing in the anti-suffrage movement and turned it towards supporting the platform of the Republican Party. Former members of the anti-suffrage group in New York became involved in the Women's National Republican Club. In this way, they left the private sphere and entered the public sphere, one of the things that they were resisting in their anti-suffrage efforts. A former anti-suffrage, Ida Tarbell, pointed out that it would take some time for women to get comfortable with voting. Some women didn't vote or get involved in politics. Others, like Ann Meyer, advocated for all anti-suffrage women not to vote in order to allow the country to suffer from what she saw as a terrible decision to allow women to vote. Next. Propaganda. Propaganda was widely used on both sides regarding women's suffrage. Most anti-suffrage propaganda were political cartoons that depicted women as masculine or wanting to become a man. an attack that was meant to ensure they were seen as freaks of nature versus demure, soft-spoken women. Suffragists wrote several plays in response to the attack made on their personhood. Not only did they write plays arguing the point, there is a play called The Vote, which was written in 1912. They also wrote plays as part of entertainment that they provided daily for 2 weeks, including stalls selling homemade goods, books, also a fake polling place for women to cast a vote for the first time, and 5 live plays daily. Next. Just like the British counterparts, American women were imprisoned during the fight for the right to vote. A Jail for Freedom pen was presented to members of the National Women's Party who served prison sentences for picketing the White House in the cause of women's suffrage. I'm sorry, I should be at slide 18, because there were 15, 16, and 17 were just some examples of the propaganda. So you can go ahead to early suffragists, Black women and the vote. In the long battle for women's suffrage and the passage of the 19th Amendment, some leading activists prioritized white women's suffrage over voting rights for all women. 2 of the most prominent women's suffragists, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were at one time part of the American Equal Rights Association, the AERA, a group they formed with Frederick Douglass and other activists in 1866. The organization's goal was to win voting rights for both women and African Americans. There is tension from the very beginning over the priority of these 2 demands, and Black women fall out of this equation. Only after 3 years of existence, the AERA dissolved over heated fights about whether to support the 15th Amendment, with which Black men won the right to vote. In the South, this victory would be short-lived. At a pivotal, I'm sorry, I'm getting dry mouth, but at a convention in 1869, Douglass argued that the AERA should support the amendment while he continued to fight for women's suffrage. Stanton not only disagreed, she gave an address filled with racist stereotypes about male immigrants and male former slaves whom the amendment would enfranchise. She said, "Think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and young Tom, who would not know the difference between a monarchy and a republic, who cannot read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for Susan B. Anthony," she said at the convention. The amendment creates an antagonism everywhere between educated, refined women and the lower orders of men, especially in the South. Both Douglass and Stanton previously attended the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights. What's particularly painful was that Douglass had been the one at the Seneca Falls Convention who stood up and defended women's rights to vote. And then when it came to the 15th Amendment, Stanton refused to reciprocate. This agreement at that convention led not only to the dissolution of the AERA, but a split in the women's suffrage movement between those who supported the 15th Amendment and those who did not. Stanton and Anthony joined the fraction that did not. And after the amendment passed, many of the suffragists on that side pandered to white Southerners by arguing that if women could vote, they could drown out the Black male vote. Anthony also sought to distance herself from Douglass, who continued to support women's suffrage for the rest of his life. During the 1890 suffrage meeting in Atlanta, she asked him not to appear on stage with white women because it would seem inappropriate. However, these racist strategies ultimately proved to be ineffective because Southern white men had already prevented Black men from voting with discriminatory poll taxes, tests, and lynching. Both Stanton and Anthony died more than a decade before the 19th Amendment passed. And although their work was instrumental in making that passage possible, they did not work to prioritize making voting rights accessible to all women. In 1920, Black women in the South and many Latinas in the Southwest were still barred from voting because of racist voting restrictions. When they tried to reach out to the main suffrage organizations at the time, they were ignored. They say basically, help us, we still can't vote. And those organizations basically answer, that's a race question. It doesn't concern us. Next, between two worlds, being Black and a woman. Was there ever a time when your voice wasn't heard? During the 19th and 20th century, Black women played an active role in the struggle for universal suffrage. They participated in political meetings and organized political societies. They attended political conventions at the local churches where they planned strategies to gain the right to vote. And in the late 1800s, more Black women worked for churches, newspapers, secondary schools, and colleges, which gave them a larger platform to promote their ideas. In spite of their hard work, many people didn't listen. Black men and white women usually led civil rights organizations and set the agenda. They often excluded Black women from their organizations and activities. For example, the National American Women's Suffrage Association prevented Black women from attending their conventions. Black women often had to march separately from white women in parades. When Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony wrote The History of Women's Suffrage in the 1880s, they featured white suffragists, largely ignoring the contributions of African Americans. Though Black women are less remembered, they played an important role in getting the 15th and 19th Amendments passed. Black women found themselves pulled in two directions. Black men wanted their support in fighting racial discrimination and prejudice, while white women wanted them to help change the inferior status of women in American societies. Both groups ignored the unique challenges that African American women face. Black reformers like Mary Church Terrell, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Harriet Tubman understood that both their race and their sex affected their rights and opportunities. Because of this unique position, Black women did tend to focus on human rights and universal suffrage rather than solely suffrage for African Americans or for women. Many Black suffragists weighed in on debate over the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised Black men but not Black women. Mary Ann Shadd Cary spoke in support of the 15th Amendment, but was also critical of it as it did not give the women the right to vote. Sojourner Truth argued that Black women would continue to face discrimination and prejudice unless their voices were uplifted like those of the Black men. Black women also believe that the issue of suffrage was too large and complex for any one group or organization to tackle alone. They hoped that different groups would work together to accomplish their shared goal. Suffragists like Nannie Helen Burroughs wrote and spoke about the need for Black and white women to cooperate to achieve the right to vote. Black women worked with mainstream suffragists and organizations like the NAWSA. However, the mainstream organizations did not address the challenges faced by Black women because of their race, such as negative stereotypes, harassment, unequal access to jobs, housing, and education. So in the late 1800s, Black women formed clubs and organizations where they could focus on the issues that affected them. In Boston, Black reformers like Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, founded the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, in 1896. The members discussed ways of attaining civil rights and women's suffrage. The NACW's motto was "Lifting as we climb," which reflected the organization's goal to uplift the status of the Black woman. In 1913, Ida B. Wells founded the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago, which was the nation's first Black women's club, focused specifically on suffrage. After the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, Black women voted in the elections and held political offices. However, many states passed laws that discriminated against African Americans and limited their freedoms. Black women continued to fight for their rights. The educator and political advisor, Mary McLeod Bethune, formed the National Council of Negro Women in 1937 to pursue civil rights. Tens of thousands of African Americans worked over several decades to secure suffrage, which occurred when the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. This act represents more than a century of work by Black women to make voting easier and more equitable. Next. Excuse me a second. The suffrage movement and white supremacy. Americans at this point in 2020 are forced to choose between a cherished lie and a disconcerting truth as they prepare to celebrate the centennial of the 19th Amendment in this year, 2020. The lie that holds the amendment ending a century-long struggle by guaranteeing women the right to vote. The truth is that it barred states from denying voting rights based on gender, but guaranteed nothing. More than a dozen states had already granted millions of women voting rights before ratification, and millions of other women, particularly African Americans in the Jim Crow South, remained shut out of polls for decades afterwards. While middle-class white women celebrated with ticker-tape parades, Black women in the former Confederacy were being defrauded by voting registrars or were being driven away from registration offices under the threat of violence. When the Black suffragist and civil rights leader, Mary Church Terrell, petitioned her white sisters for help, they responded that the disenfranchisement of Black women was a race problem, not a gender problem, and beyond the movement's writ. This counterfeit distinction was familiar to Black suffragists who had argued for more than 50 years that they could no more separate gender from race in themselves than to shed their skins. The movement, however, tended toward the definition of women that was implicitly limited to people of the gender who were white and middle class. And its most prominent advocates, Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony, drove home that notion by rendering Black women nearly invisible by the hugely influential history of women's suffrage. As the push for white women's rights neared its goal, which was ended in a constitutional amendment, the movement hedged its bets by compromising with white supremacists. The official suffrage history reduces poet and novelist Frances Ellen Watkins Harper to a bit player, even though she was central to the struggles of both African American and women's rights and delivered what has become recognized as a visionary speech on the relationship between the two at the founding meeting of the American Equal Rights Association in 1866. Harper believed deeply in interracial collaboration, but committed to it on the condition that white women treat Black women as equals. As the historian Allison Parker has written, Harper vexed white women reformers by accusing them of being directly complicit in the oppression of Blacks, and by demanding that they rid themselves of racism. A committed egalitarian, she balked when suffragists embraced the definition of women that included only the educated and the affluent. In a now famous speech given in New York, Harper told the audiences that fates of Black and white, rich and poor, were all bound up together. She refused to decouple race from gender, arguing that the day-to-day racism she, I, and other Black women experienced then and experienced now was in fact a woman's issue that suffragists are obligated to confront. You white women speak here of rights, Harper said that day in 1866. I speak of wrongs. Reciting the litany of humiliations that Black women had to endure on public conveyances, not because they were women, but because they were Black. She asked, are there no wrongs to be righted? Harper's speech anticipated by more than a century of the intersectional legal analysis of the critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, who showed how policies that treat race and gender as mutually exclusive deprive Black women of redress in discrimination cases while also obscuring the fact that they struggle under dual burdens of racism and sexism. The history of women's suffrage draws heavily on the proceedings of the 1866 meeting, but tellingly leaves out Harper's momentous speech. The historian Nell Painter argues that her words in that speech were too strong for white suffrage leaders who saw her as polished, self-assured style and as antithetical to what they viewed as Blackness. They preferred the uneducated version of the Black womanhood, who some thought was embodied by the formerly enslaved suffragist Sojourner Truth, who entertained her audiences as she imparted her ideas. Yet Harper's poise and self-possession were the norm among affluent, freed-born Black women who at the time had to engage in the suffrage movement. For example, the sisters Harriet Purvis, Margarita Fortin were daughters of the wealthy Philadelphia sailmaker and abolitionist James Fortin and his wife, Charlotte, were central players in the staging of the 5th National Women's Rights Convention in their hometown in 1854. The Boston journalist Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who played a leadership role in the mass suffrage movement, the Massachusetts suffrage movement in the late 1800s, was the wife of pro-suffrage state legislator George L. Ruffin. Another respected suffragist and abolitionist, but then again, whose voice was missing for the suffrage narrative, is Sarah Parker Remond, who grew up in a prominent New England family. Remond, like Harper, was a member of the American Equal Rights Association. She was popular on the abolitionist speaking circuit and also toured the Northeast with her brother Charles in the late 1860s in support of women's rights voting. Chroniclers of the suffrage struggle tended not to record their Black peers. Fortunately, the 1853 lawsuit Redmond filed against 2 men who ejected her from an opera in Boston for reasons of race provides a window into what she believed. The archivist Dorothy Wesley writes in her study of the Redmond family that the judge issued a forceful decision, fully sustaining the equal rights of our colored citizens. We also know that Redmond grew extremely tired of racism in the US and fled to Europe. Next, controlling the narrative. The heroes of the suffragist movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Elizabeth B. Anthony, seized control of that narrative of the 19th century. Their influential history of the movement still governs popular understanding of the struggle for women's rights and will no doubt serve as a touchstone for commemorations that will unfold across the United States around the centennial of the 19th Amendment. That narrative in the 6th-volume History of Women's Suffrage betrays more than a hint of vanity when it credits the Stanton-Anthony cohort with starting a movement that actually had diverse origins and many mothers. Its worst offenses may be that it rendered nearly invisible the Black woman who labored in the suffragist movement, and that it looked away from the racism that tightened its grip on the fight for women's votes in the years after the Civil War. Historians Elsa Brown, Lori Ginsburg, and Rosalind Penn have recently provided an unsparing portrait of this once neglected period. Stripped of her halo, Stanton is exposed as a classic liberal racist who embraced fairness in the abstract while publicly enunciating bigoted views of African American men, who she characterized as Sambos, and insipid racist in the period after the war, and insipid rapist in the period just after the war. The suffrage struggle itself took on a similar flavor, acquiescing to white supremacists and selling out the interest of African American women when it became politically expedient to do so. This betrayal of trust opened a rift between Black and white feminists that persists in some capacity to this day. It became clear after the Civil War that Black and white women had different views of why the right to vote was essential. White women were seeking the vote as a symbol of parity with their husbands and brothers. Black women, most of whom lived in the South, were seeking the ballot for themselves and their men as a means of empowering Black communities besieged by the reign of racial terror erupted after emancipation. The tension escalated in the run-up to the 15th Amendment, a provision that ostensibly barred states from denying Negro men the right to vote. Reasonable people could, of course, disagree on the merits of who should first be given the right to vote, women or Black men. Stanton instead embarked on a clam-like tirade against the amendment. She warned that white women would be denigrated if Negro men preceded them in the franchise. Admiring historians have dismissed this as an unfortunate interlude in an exemplary life led by Stanton. By contrast, Lori Ginsburg, the historian, argues that racism and elitism were enduring features of Stanton's makeup and philosophy. Similarly, the historian Faye Dutton wrote that Stanton dipped her pen into a tincture of white racism and sketched a reference to a nightmarish figure, the Black rapist, and lashed out from the pages of the suffrage paper that she and Anthony published. Her message, that the passage of the 15th Amendment would mean only degradation for women at the hands of Negro men. And this must have cheered the Ku Klux Klan as it terrorized the Black South. Douglass was clearly wounded by what he described as the employment of certain names, such as Sambo, the gardener, and the bootblack, and all the rest, but gracefully declined to answer insult with insult. Instead, he summarized in dramatic fashion the difference between interests of Black and white suffragists and the case for federal protection of Black voters. When women, because they are women, he said, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms, their brains are dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, when they have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. Douglass cut to the fallacy of the white suffrage push, that African American women could magically separate their Blackness from their femaleness. The 15th Amendment, of course, ratified. Women would wait another 50 years for the 19th Amendment. Racism intensified among suffragists as they neared their goals. African American luminaries like the noted anti-lynching crusader Ida B. Wells and the civil rights leader Mary Church Terrell became more deeply and publicly engaged. The most blatant example of accommodationism came in 1913 when the organizers of a huge suffrage parade in Washington demanded that the Black participants march in an all-Black assembly at the back of the parade instead of with their state delegations. Wells famously refused. Terrell, who marched in the colored delegation as requested, believed at the time that white suffragists would exclude Black women from the 19th Amendment, nicknamed the Anthony Amendment, if they could get away with it. These episodes fueled within the African American community as a lasting suspicion of white suffragists and the very idea of political cooperation across racial lines. Historians are warning groups involved in suffrage commemorations not to overstate the, excuse me, not to overstate the significance of the 19th Amendment. It covered the needs of middle-class white women quite nicely, but it meant very little to Black women in the South, where most lived at the time and where election officials were well practiced in the art of obstructing Black access to the ballot box. As African American women streamed in to register, Southern officials merely stepped up the level of fraud and intimidation. By this time, the former suffragists of the North were celebrating the amendment and were uninterested in fighting discrimination against women who were suffering racial as opposed to gender discrimination. It would take another half century and a new suffrage campaign with Black women in a leading role before the Black community was fully enfranchised through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The recent uproar over monuments to white supremacy that dominate public spaces in the South has put civic groups on notice that memorials often convey pernicious messages and perpetrate historical wrongs. Next. Black women had to fight for the right to vote on two fronts. Honoring Black suffragists means first acknowledging how they were sidelined from the mainstream suffrage movement, whose leaders feel alienating white women and losing support in the South, says Ida Jones. Ida Jones, who is a university archivist at Morgan State University in Baltimore. Sometimes the discrimination was overt, as when organizers of that 1913 suffrage parade ordered Black participants to march at the end. Other times it was subtle. The National American Woman Suffrage Organization, formed in 1890, declined to include Black women or suffrage groups in its rank. And this exclusion spurred the formation of separate organizations, such as the National Association of Colored Women, founded in 1896 in the nation's capital. Prominent Black suffragists such as Mary Church Terrell, who was born to former slaves in 1864, led the group and also went on to help found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909 in New York City. Leaders like Terrell didn't ask for a place in the suffrage movement. They took their place in the movement in a variety of ways. Tenacious is not a strong enough word for them. Facing the double bind of racism and sexism, Black suffragists participated in the movement through whatever means were available to them, particularly journalism and the Black press. Ida B. Wells, a pioneer and journalist and anti-lynching advocate, helped found Chicago's Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913, which helped register thousands of Black women to vote through on-the-ground canvassing efforts. They used poetry, they used speeches, events, lectures, every avenue that was available to place themselves in the movement and to secure the right to vote for their people. Historians also note the important differences between the motivations of white suffragists who were working primarily on with gender equality in mind, and the Black suffragists who saw voting rights as the key part of racial equity and a means of uplifting their community. In fact, the roots of the suffrage movement can be traced to the abolition movement, whose champions called for gender equality alongside the end of slavery as early as the mid-19th century, when abolitionist Sojourner Truth delivered her historic "Ain't I a Woman" speech in 1851 at the 1851 Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio. In 1866, the poet and abolitionist Frances Watkins Harper would deliver a rousing speech of her own at a National Women's Rights Convention in New York. She said, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and the feeblest of its members without receiving the curse on its own soul." When we look back at the 19th Amendment, even though it passed on paper, African American women were not allowed to exercise that freely. In much of the country, as we know, poll taxes, literally tests, kept Black voters disenfranchised until the passing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices. To this day, obstacles still persist in voting, and a new generation of politicians, such as Georgia's Stacey Abrams, have taken up the fight against voter suppressions. African American women continue to fight for and advocate for the voiceless, the poor in the urban and rural areas, the uneducated, and the immigrant community. All of this is bound up into one big issue: true democracy. Next. The first Black suffragist, or the first recorded Black suffragist, is Sojourner Truth, who was born Isabella Bumfree. If you look at the top of the screen, the top right, that is portrayed to be her signature. "Ain't I a Woman?" This is the speech that she delivered at the Women's Rights Convention in 1851 in Akron, Ohio. She said, "May I say a few words? I want to say a few words about this matter. I am a woman's rights. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man, and I can eat as much too if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellectual, all I can say is, if women have a pint and men have a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights for fear we will take too much, but we can't take more than our pint will hold." The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have a woman's rights, give it to her and you will feel better. You will have your own rights and they won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. I've heard the Bible and have learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if women upset the world, do give her the chance to set it right side up again. The lady has spoken about Jesus, how he never spurned woman from him, and she was right. When Lazarus died, Mary and Martha came to him with faith and love and besought him to rise their brother. And Jesus wept, and Lazarus came forth. And how came Jesus into the world? Through God who created him and woman who bore him. Man, where is your part? Being the woman but women are coming up blessed, be God, and a few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Woman is coming on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. Next. Black women leaders in the suffrage movement. Black suffragists had to face a two-pronged attack. Not only were they discriminated against for their gender, but they also were further discriminated against for the color of their skin. So here are some of the Black women leaders. Ida B. Wells, a journalist and anti-lynching activist, founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in 1913, which registered several thousand Black female votes through canvassing. Despite winning the vote, and winning is in parentheses, in 1920, Black people, especially women, still had to contend with poll taxes, literacy tests in order to vote, which means there was not universal voting until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Mary Church was one of the first African-American women to earn a college degree and became known as a national activist for civil rights and suffrage. She taught in the Latin department at the M Street School, the first African-American public high school in the nation in Washington, D.C. Mary Burnett Talbot was an American orator, activist, suffragist, and reformer, called the best-known colored woman in the United States. Talbot was among the most prominent African Americans of her time. In 2005, Talbot was inducted into the Women's National Hall of Fame, the bottom row, left to right. Hester C. Jeffrey, also known as Whitehurst, was an African American activist, suffragist, community organizer in New York City. She is known for her involvement with the Political Equity Club, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the National Association of Colored Women's Club. Gertrude Bustell Hicks Muscle was an African-American journalist, teacher, and activist. She served as the women's editor of the New York Age from 1885 to 1889, and of the Indianapolis World from 1891 to 1892. Mary Ann Shadd Cary was an American-Canadian anti-slavery activist, journalist, publisher, teacher, and lawyer. She was the first Black woman publisher in North America and the first woman publisher in Canada. Harriet Fortin Purvis, an African-American abolitionist and first-generation suffragist. With her mother and sisters, she formed the first biracial women's abolitionist group, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Frances Watkins Harper was an abolitionist, suffragist, poet, teacher, public speaker, and writer, one of the first African-American women to be published in the United States. Born free in Baltimore, Maryland, she had a long and prolific career, publishing her first book of poetry at the age of 20. And Krista Adair became a civil rights activist and suffrage after she was turned away from a polling place in Texas, despite being able to register to vote. She then joined the NAACP in Houston, becoming its secretary, where she had access to membership roles. After NAACP had a landmark win, the Houston office became the subject of bombing threats, during which she refused to give the membership roles to the police. Throughout her lifetime, she fought for the right to serve on juries, testified at various trials against the police, and was the first Black woman to be elected to the Democratic Executive Committee of Texas in 1966, although she was refused the seat. Next. African American women and the 19th Amendment. The 15th Amendment proposed, which would give Black men the right to vote, but not women, is where the coalition begins to break down. Suffragists could either choose universal voting rights or for Black male suffrage. This led Stanton and Anthony to leave the AERA and form the National Women's Suffrage Association, which promoted universal suffrage and were against Black men getting the vote before white women. So not necessarily not getting the vote, but they wanted the vote first. Stanton and Anthony's racism towards Black men led to another further split between themselves and Black suffragists who were also allies of those, including Frederick Douglass and Francis Watkins. Watkins remarked, "As much as white women need the vote, colored women need it more." Black male suffrage was being denounced, so Black women incorporated Black male suffrage into their overall goals. Black women, including Charlotte Rollins, Frances and Louisa Rollins, and Mary Ann Shadd Cary, continued their suffrage work outside of conferences and organizations. Charlotte Rollins in 1866 went to the South Carolina House of Representatives and declared that universal suffrage was needed. She and her sisters were active in Reconstruction and women's suffrage politics in the 1870s. They, along with women like Mary Ann Shadd Cary, were attempting unsuccessfully to register to vote on election day. Tensions between Black women and the national suffrage movement continue as white suffragists, Stanton Anthony especially, sought support from Southern white males and females. In the late 19th century, Black women suffragists linked women's right to vote and effective reform work. This led many Black women becoming active in the temperance movement. Hattie Purvis, Ellen Watkins Harper, and Gertrude Bustell Mossel. Purvis and Harper served in the Women's Christian Temperance Union as superintendent of work among colored people. To them, intemperance was an obstacle to racial advancement, and the passage of this and women's suffrage would reduce social ills. Purvis was also a delegate to the National Women's Suffrage Association from 1883 to 1900. Mossel wrote pro-suffrage articles in Black magazines, the infamous of them being Women's Suffrage, an article that encouraged her readers to learn the history of suffrage and women's groups. In the latter part of the 1880s and 1890s, Black women were increasingly shut out of these meetings, of suffrage meetings, marches, and campaigns. Even when the leaders of the NWSA, Stanton and Anthony, and the AWSA, Stone and Ward Howe, reunited to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, loyalty to white Southerners was still shown over Black suffragists. In 1895, Anthony asked Douglass not to attend this convention in Atlanta because although he had supported the rights of white women, she did not want to offend the Southern host. The ratification of the 19th Amendment increased the divide, particularly in the South. African American women voters in the Jim Crow South encountered the same disenfranchisement strategies that an anti-Black violence led to, the disenfranchisement of Black men. Following the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the battle for the right to vote ended for white women. But for African American women, the outcome was less clear. Hoping to combat World War I anti-Black radical racial violence and the disenfranchisement of Black men, particularly in the South, Black women's engagements in electoral politics, radical activism expanded. An examination of Black women's post-1920 political life reveals that rather than ending, the 19th Amendment was the starting point for Black American women's involvement in the electoral politics in the years up to 1960. Next. And here are some associations of Black women suffragists that formed. And we had the American Rights Association, which was formed in 1866. According to its constitution, the purpose of it was to secure equal rights to all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex. The American Women's Suffrage Association was a single issue national organization formed in 1869 in Boston. The AWSA lobbied state governments to enact laws granting or expanding women's right to vote in the United States. The Colored Women's Progressive Franchise was an organization advocating the equal rights of African American women, organized by Mary Ann Shadd Cary in 1880. The organization paved the path for the movement of Black women's organizations and institutions that articulated feminist concerns and agendas, which followed the end of the Reconstruction. It preceded the Women's Club movement in Washington, D.C. by more than a decade. Its confrontational and radical style, led by Shadd Cary, are one of the reasons it did not last long. The National Association of Colored Women Clubs is an organization that was formed in July of 1896 in Washington, D.C. From 1896 to 1904, it was known as the National Association of Colored Women, which adopted the motto, "Lifting as we climb," to demonstrate to an ignorant and suspicious world that our aims and interests are identical to those of all good aspiring women. When incorporated in 1904, NACW became known as the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, the NACWC. And the one that people are most familiar with is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And it is a civil rights organization formed in 1909 as an interracial endeavor to advance justice for African Americans by a group including W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary White Ovington, Moorfield Story, and Ida B. Wells. And here are some key dates for the Black suffragists. May 29, 1851, abolitionist and former slave Sojourner Truth speaks at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, where she gave a speech which was later known as "Ain't I a Woman?" May 10th, 1866, abolitionist and poet Frances Ellen Watkins Harper speaks at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York City. May 1866, the American Equal Rights Association is formed when the National Women's Rights Convention and American Anti-Slavery Society merged. The group dissolves about 4 years later amid continuing disagreements and prioritizing race or gender in the fight for voting rights. July 1896, the National Association of Colored Women is founded. The group endorses women's suffrage in 1912. August 18th, 1920, Tennessee, my home state, becomes the 36th state to ratify the Constitution's 19th Amendment, which guarantees a woman's right to vote. And August 6, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act, which outlawed the discriminatory voting practices that many Southern states adopted after the Civil War to restrict Black men and women from voting. Next, Native Americans. Native Americans were not US citizens when the country ratified its Constitution in 1788 and would not become citizens for another 136 years. When Black Americans won citizenships with the 14th Amendment in 1868, the government specifically interpreted the law so it did not apply to Native Americans. In 1924, Native people won the right to full citizenship when President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act. He used it to break up Native nations and forcibly assimilate them into American society. Native Americans fought to vote state by state, as determined by the Constitution, with the exception of the 15th and 19th Amendment, which many states violated anyway by preventing Black people from voting. The last state to fully guarantee voting rights for Native people was Utah in 1962. However, Native Americans were still prevented from voting with poll tax, literacy tests, and intimidations, the same tactics used against Black voters. Some Native people or Native Americans who didn't want US citizenship since they were already part of their own sovereign nations. However, these nations still found their lands and the lives of their people subject to the whims of a country that would not recognize them as citizens. Next. Asian American democracy projects. Chinese immigrants were not able to become citizens and vote until the Magnuson Act of 1943. Throughout the United States history, Asian Americans have been disenfranchised by discriminatory laws that denied citizenship and voting rights to Asian immigrants. It was not until 1943 that Chinese Americans were permitted to become citizens. For Asian Indians, that was 1946. For Japanese Americans and others, 1952. AALDEF witnessed and received hundreds of complaints from Asian American voters on election day, ranging from hostile poll workers making racist comments towards Asian American voters, to improper demands for identification or proof of citizenship from Asian American voters. The Voter Education 2012 is in response to a wave of state laws that threaten voting rights of Asian Americans. The AALDEF offered a series of legal trainings in multiple cities reviewing voters' rights, voter registration, and election rules. They also released fact sheets on state voting laws, beginning in New York, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. In 1994, the AALDEF successfully got the first Chinese language ballots in New York City. In October 2011, the Census Bureau announced that under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, bilingual ballots and language assistance must be provided to Asian American voters in 11 states and in 6 languages, in 6 Asian languages, also in Vietnamese, Korean, Chinese, and Tagalog, which is the Filipino language. Next. When will it end? Female suffragists and anti-suffragists are passionate about their beliefs. Some took to the streets and public places, boldly protesting that they should, or in some cases should not, have the right to vote. Some believed the right to vote was only natural as they were equal to men. Some believed that they were different from men and therefore had the moral duty to vote. Some believed that voting would not only take away from their duties in the home, but also add to an ill-informed government. Others believed that the matter of voting to be a concern for the bored upper classes who held influence and prestige in many other realms. In the end, the vote was granted. First in 1920 for white women, and then in 1965 for all women. Women's rights are still an ongoing struggle. The right to receive abortions, birth control, and rights, equal rights under the law. Next, and this last video is it's very nice. So this is the end of the presentation.
With 2 older brothers, I've got a lot to look up to. Mom was worried about my growth, so she gave me Pediasure. My doctor says it got protein, 25 vitamins and minerals, and antioxidants for immune support. And I love it. Pediasure, nutrition for growth and immune support.
And
Well, thank you very much, Jessica.
I
Before,
do have one more thing to say. I'm sorry.
oh, go ahead.
Okay. All I wanted to say is that as we come to the 100th year anniversary of women's suffrage, we all know that we all need to come together, regardless of who you are, what phrase, what you're covered in, to uphold this phrase in the Constitution, which says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.